Something terrifying awaits 2 million Russians. They all made the same mistake of having served in their country's military long before Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. That service is about to become their sacrifice. Putin is about to do something devastating to as many of the 2 million as he can in one of the most deranged moves of the war so far. But this isn't a sign of Putin's strength. It's an indication that Russia's leader is so desperate that he's willing to break his army and his country apart to get what he wants. What Putin has done is simple. He has laid the groundwork for the mobilization of up to 2 million Russian reservists who thought that their time serving Putin's demands was over and done. That's according to United 24 media, which said on February 19th that Putin is about to make a crazy decision that will cripple Russia from the inside out, all to serve the war that he started. As the casualties mount and it becomes clear that Russia is running out of volunteers that it can pay to kill themselves for Putin's ludicrous ambitions, Russia's president is passing legislation that will make it easier than ever before for him to tap into a wellspring of manpower that wants absolutely nothing to do with Ukraine. Soon, the former soldiers in that wellspring, along with those who have been trained but never fought, won't have a choice. Putin is coming for them. United 24 media says that Russia passed legislation in late 2025 that cleared the way for Putin to tap into the 2 million strong mobilization reserve that Russia has. Those who are called up via this legislation won't have any choice in the matter. There will be no massive sign-up bonuses offered, and it's unclear whether these mobilized soldiers will be getting paid anywhere near the same amount of money as the thousands of dollars a month that those who have volunteered to fight in Putin's invasion are getting. But Putin is trying to force the reservists onto the front lines anyway, and we'll tell you precisely why in just a few minutes. On the legislation front, Putin has been laying the groundwork for what he's about to try to do almost since the day he invaded Ukraine. As the Kyiv Independent notes, the past 4 years have seen Putin work to make draft evasion more difficult. Penalties and jail time have increased, the outlet says. Russia has also created digital registries filled with the names of conscripts, and those registries are now tightly controlled so that the Kremlin knows who it can call up and when. Putin has also made it easier for the Russian military to get its hands on the country's reserves. No longer do police or recruiters have to serve paper notices to the people that Putin wants to call up. Draft notices can now be sent electronically, and anybody who attempts to avoid the notice or claims that they didn't receive it will essentially be taken anyway. They'll be punished with prison sentences, and Putin will make the offer again: fight for me or languish in a prison cell. Most of these reservists won't volunteer for the war in Ukraine, though a small number may choose to enlist on their own initiative. Euronews made that clear in a February 20th report, where it highlighted comments made by the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW. According to the ISW, the Kremlin is about to restart rolling and involuntary military call-ups. Criticism of this move is also being shut down by yet more legislation. On February 18th, Russia's State Duma passed a bill that features preventative measures against the evasion of the duty to defend the fatherland, as well as against the distortion of historical truth. That bill was passed at the first reading, likely with no amendments, and it amounts to Putin telling his people one thing: fight and die when I tell you. We're about to tell you why Putin is doing all of this, but before we do, the question has to be asked: can Russia even mobilize enough people for Putin's war? Unfortunately, the short answer is yes, as Global Firepower points out. The organization, which ranks the world's militaries based on several factors, including manpower, says that Russia does indeed have an estimated 2 million reservists, who add to the active Russian army that it says contains 1.32 million people. Russia also has an average yearly mobilization potential of 1.25 million. Which would amount to yet more non-combatants being forced into a fight that they would have already volunteered for if they wanted to be involved. And that desire, or lack thereof, is a problem for Putin. The Kremlin has been giving volunteers enormous sums of money to fight for Russia in Ukraine. Those who are motivated by cash payouts or actually align with Putin's vision for the destruction of Ukraine will already be fighting. That leaves the unmotivated. Those who are trying to avoid the war may soon be forced into it anyway. That's who Putin is going to be turning to if he pushes forward with the mobilization for which he has laid all of the groundwork. Which brings us back to the obvious question that needs to be asked: why does Putin need to do this? Desperation is the obvious answer. Despite the global firepower numbers, Russia has a major manpower problem in Ukraine. The UK's Defence Secretary John Healey revealed that in mid-February, as he noted that Russia has been forced to turn to recruiting soldiers from foreign countries to make up the numbers in its ailing army. In January alone, Russia lost over 9,000 more soldiers than it was able to mobilize for the month, United 24 media adds. Plus, Ukraine has set itself a target of eliminating 50,000 Russian soldiers per month. which given the state of the Russian forces on the ground seems eminently achievable. What Putin sees here is a recipe for the demolition of the only strategy that he has in Ukraine. Everything that Russia has gained so far, and that only amounts to about 20% of Ukraine since Putin launched his campaign of aggression back in 2014, has been built on the back of Russia being able to wage a war of attrition. Putin's approach has always been, there's more where they came from, when it comes to the sheer amount of death that his strategic incompetence has inflicted on the Russian military. Only, there isn't more. Not anymore. And it may soon be 2 million reservists whom Putin will force, or more accurately, attempt to force, to make up for his failures. The mobilization that Putin is planning is going to backfire enormously on Russia's leader, so keep watching to find out why Russia's president may be about to make his biggest mistake so far. We mentioned Russia's increasing reliance on foreign fighters a moment ago. The Atlantic Council reported on this on February 19th. It was revealed that Russia has recruited an estimated 20,000 people from foreign countries to fight in Putin's war, with many of those people coming from either the former Soviet republics or low-income nations in South Asia, in the Middle East, and especially Africa. In fact, it's the focus on Africa that reveals how desperate Putin has become for soldiers. About 1,400 men from the African continent have been recruited, and about a fifth of those so-called soldiers are already dead. On the front lines, Russia's African contingent is mocked and referred to as disposable, the outlet says. There is even an example of one African recruit who was seen with an anti-tank mine strapped to his chest. Whether the soldier was being used as a sort of kamikaze bomb against Ukraine or was being forced to carry the mine because Russia has run out of equipment wasn't clear, but it also doesn't matter. The takeaway here is that Putin has taken an almost colonial response to finding new soldiers for his invasion. Africans and other foreign fighters are being used precisely because Putin doesn't want to recruit from the more affluent regions of Russia. The mercenaries are seen as holding no value to Russia's leader. However, like those inside Russia that Putin is now planning to mobilize, Russia's foreign mercenaries often aren't in Ukraine by choice. They get deceived and then they die. We're going to dig deeper into that in just a moment, but before we do, the Military Show brings you the full picture, not just the headlines. Hit subscribe to ensure that you stay ahead of the curve. Returning to how Russia is getting its foreign fighters, UNN says that the Kremlin is sneakily combining so-called humanitarian initiatives with a form of covert military recruitment that is essentially tricking people into fighting for Putin's cause. According to the outlet, Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service says that Russia has been building educational, religious, and cultural networks inside African countries, which it's been using to filter people into the Russian army under the guise of being benevolent forces in the countries in which these networks are formed. This is a sick form of recruitment based on deception and coercion over the desire of those who end up fighting for Russia. And there are plenty of examples. Russia has launched the Alabuga Start program, UNN reports, which targets young women aged around 18 to 22 in foreign countries. Those women are promised civilian work but invariably end up in drone factories building unmanned aerial vehicles for the war. Russia has also spent the last 4 years spreading the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church, which it has transformed into an abomination of a recruitment. Potential soldiers are indoctrinated with messages about maintaining traditional values as Russia sees them, with that indoctrination then used to recruit individuals who think that they're willing to fight for the values that Russia teaches them until Ukrainian drones are flying over their heads. This approach has worked for a while. However, the pushback is starting, so Putin knows that his foreign recruitment networks are going to dry up soon. On February 10th, the BBC reported that Kenya is already planning to confront Russia over what its foreign minister, Musalia Mudavadi, calls the unacceptable and clandestine nature of Russian recruitment in Kenya. About 200 Kenyan nationals have already been tricked into fighting for Russia, and Kenya wants to ensure that no more follow. 27 of the 200 have already been repatriated, and Kenya has already closed 600 recruitment agencies that it says have been duping people into taking the so-called jobs overseas. The odds are that other foreign countries where Russia has been pulling its fake recruitment tricks are going to do similar things. And if you were paying attention to the numbers we shared, you can probably already tell that even the 20,000 people that Russia has recruited so far are nowhere near enough to fill the manpower gap that the country's army has as a result of Ukraine's exceptionally effective defense. So we come back to the sacrifice Putin is preparing to make that will tear his country apart. This sacrifice is going to backfire, as we'll cover in a moment, but it also shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who follows Putin's logic for launching the war. For Putin, this invasion was never about money or shutting down what he claimed to be far-right influences in Ukraine. It is, and has always been, an ideological campaign launched by a man who wants to bring Russia back to the former glory that it had during the Soviet days. For a warped idealist like Putin, it doesn't matter how many Russians die for his cause. Ukraine has already inflicted 1.25 million casualties, which is roughly the same number of active soldiers that Russia has in its military. Those sorts of numbers are only possible when the soldiers who are dying in Ukraine are being sent onto the battlefield by a leader who doesn't care how many have to die as long as he gets what he wants in the end. Going all the way back to October 2022, former Russian diplomat Boris Bondarev, who was once part of Russia's permanent mission to the United Nations, labeled Putin's reign up to the beginning of the war as very lucky, and even went as far to claim that Putin isn't smart. However, that lack of intelligence isn't a good thing for Russia or its people. You should have no doubt about it, he may sacrifice 10 or 20 million Russians just to win this war, just to slaughter all Ukrainians because it's a matter of principle. It's a matter of political survival to him, Bondarev said of Putin, adding that the invasion has now become a matter of survival for a leader who has no other way out. The war has to go on, or Putin is gone. Which leads us right back to how Russia's president is doing something that is going to backfire horribly. Let's take you back to the last time that Russia mobilized. It was September 2022, and Putin's so-called special military operation had already failed. Ukraine hadn't collapsed as Russia thought it would. Far from it, in fact, as many of Russia's early gains had already been reversed, and Ukraine was putting up a defense that we now know lasted for 4 years and counting. With his army struggling, Putin announced a partial mobilization of reservists to go and fight in Ukraine. Remember the word partial, it's important. That initial round of mobilization saw Russia draft about 300,000 people into its army, before the Kremlin changed tack and started using obscene amounts of money to tempt volunteer soldiers into the fight. That partial mobilization was met with a massive backlash in Russia, and this was at a time when confidence was still somewhat high that Russia would win in Ukraine. The cost of the 300,000 reservists ended up being an estimated 700,000 to 900,000 Russians leaving their country, the ISW points out. That's a huge outflow of people for a country that Russian officials are saying will need another 2.4 million workers by 2030. And this was all the result of a partial mobilization. If Putin institutes the full mobilization for which he has laid the groundwork, the results would be disastrous for Russia. Up to 2 million people who could be working inside Russia will disappear into military service. That almost doubles the number of new workers that Russia is going to need by 2030, and it saps labor out of a country that is already struggling with a shortfall of 800,000 workers in the manufacturing sector alone. Russia needs another 1.5 million on top of that for its construction, trade, and service industry. Pulling another 2 million people out of Russia's non-war-based economy now just means the crippling of a country that is already sagging under the weight of Putin's war. That's not to mention the potential for yet more Russians to flee their country. If up to 900,000 Russians ran due to a partial mobilization of 300,000, what effect would the mobilization of 2 million have? The math says that Russia is preparing to call up 6.6 times more soldiers, which would translate into an exodus of 6 million people if we see the same response to what we saw in September 2022. Of course, that's speculative, especially now that Russia has made so many laws that it intends to use to punish draft dodgers. But even if the exodus is much smaller, it would likely still amount to hundreds of thousands of Russians gone on top of the 2 million called up, and almost 1.26 million and counting who have been killed, injured, or captured in Ukraine. The numbers don't really add up. Yes, Russia can mobilize if we look at the population and the number of reservists alone, but the question of whether it should is answered by the dire economic situation that the country finds itself in, and the massive backlash that will make September 2022 seem like a picnic for Putin. Of course, Russia shouldn't mobilize under the conditions that Putin has created, but Russia's president is acting out of desperation, and there's a little twist to all of this that offers another reason why Putin is going to break apart the Russian military with his deranged sacrifice. We'll get to that twist very soon. First, a little background. At around the same time that news of Putin's intended sacrifice broke, The Telegraph published an interesting report. It claimed that Russian commanders have a nice little grift going on where they demand sums of up to £30,000 or about $40,400 from their soldiers as bribes. Those bribes pay for the soldiers not to be sent to the front lines, and this isn't the only grift that commanders have going on. In addition to stripping Putin's volunteer soldiers of the money that brought them into the Ukraine war in the first place, commanders are taking equipment from the soldiers. Extortion is commonplace on the front lines, as even soldiers who are commended for their bravery are being denied transfers unless they cough up. All of this is disgusting, of course, but it also raises an interesting theory about what could happen if Putin mobilizes in Russia. Trying to pull up to 2 million soldiers into the Russian military is far from cheap. Russia's entire volunteer recruitment campaign runs on cash, which is why the commanders are able to extort in the first place. Will the cash run out with mobilization? Will the Kremlin even offer the massive signing bonuses and wages that it's been giving to its volunteers to reservists that it drafts into Ukraine? If we assume that the cash will run out and the reservists don't get their money, then what about the commanders? Based on the Telegraph report, Russia's military runs on corruption, where those higher up the chain abuse the lower down to enrich themselves. As the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, puts it, the bribes that are needed to stay alive in Ukraine are now making the idea of serving far less appealing, even to those who really need Putin's money. The cash dries up, Russia's commanders may revolt. Why would they keep doing what they're doing without the fringe benefits that Russia's military system offers them? The Kremlin seems to be making no effort to stop these commanders, which amounts to tacit approval. One former soldier named Viktor Svobodchikov had been trying for a year to bring his commander to account through the appropriate channels at the time of CEPA's June 2025 report. Now, here's the twist. Putin's desperate mobilization may have the unintended side effect of ruining the Russian military's command structure. Commanders won't care about executing the Kremlin's orders if they're not making their bit on the side. What this could amount to is a command structure that puts no effort into forming any sort of strategy. The meat being sent in by mobilization will just be sent to die to Ukraine's drones, as the soldiers will offer no other value to their commanders. The irony here is that all that mobilization would do in this situation is make the problem that led to the need for mobilization in the first place even worse. Something terrifying does indeed await 2 million Russians. The dying gasp of Putin's desperate Ukraine invasion is going to get them killed. After all, Ukraine has been building up its defenses to the point where it can attrit Russia at a remarkable rate already. Take its drone defense. Ukraine has turned hunting Russians into a 24/7 McDonald's-like operation that is churning through Russian forces. Ukraine's drone operators will have a field day with Putin's desperate mobilization, and you can find out why in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the Military Show for more analysis of the moves that Putin makes, because he doesn't realize that he's already in checkmate. And thank you, as always, for watching.